The alarms on the transport ship were not for me. That was the first thing I understood, as the doors sealed behind me, and the cold air of a human vessel touched my skin for the first time. The alarms were routine, a shift change, a docking sequence, nothing more. Yet my heart's pounded, as if the ship itself was deciding whether to let me live. My name is Sarah Vecton, and 11 days ago, I was told I would become a bride to end a war I did not start, and never understood. The Veil Compact, my people's alliance of old and proud empires, had fought the humans for 11 years. We had better numbers, we had older ships, we had more worlds and more soldiers and more weapons than any single human fleet could match. And still, every campaign against them ended the same way. Our ships would vanish into silence, our colonies would go quiet, reports would stop arriving. No triumphant human broadcasts followed, no demands, no occupation, just silence, and the war continued as if nothing had happened at all. The council called it a stalemate. I called it something else, though I did not have the words for it yet. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe respect, buried so deep under our pride that no one dared name it. I was chosen because I was expendable in the way that only a princess with no real political power can be expendable. My mother ruled a fading house. My father was already a memory. I had spent my life learning languages, protocols, and the art of smiling at people who wished to erase my family from history. When the council decided that a marriage would end the war, my name rose to the top of a very short list, and no one on that list had the strength to refuse. I did not refuse either. I told myself it was duty. It was easier to believe that than to admit I was afraid of what would happen to my people if I said no. The human officer sent to receive me stood at the end of a gray corridor, his hands folded behind his back, in a posture that seemed almost apologetic. I had expected armor. I had expected weapons resting visibly at his side, the way our own honor guards displayed their blades even during peace talks, a silent reminder of what waited beneath politeness. Instead, he wore a simple uniform, no ornamentation, no visible weapon at all. His name was Elias Voss, and he did not bow, nor did he command me to bow. He simply said, in careful and heavily accented compact speech, that he was glad the transport had arrived safely, and asked if I was hungry. I did not answer. I had prepared responses for threats, for demands, for cruelty disguised as courtesy. I had nothing prepared for a simple question about food. The corridor we walked through was narrower than any I had known in compact architecture, built for function rather than grandeur. There were no guards stationed every few steps, no cameras hidden behind decorative moldings, no soldiers whose eyes followed me the way I was used to being followed in my own palace. It unsettled me more than any show of force would have. A palace with no guards is either supremely confident or supremely foolish, and I did not yet know which one I was walking into. Elias spoke as we walked, explaining small things. Where the mess hall was, where I might rest, that the ship would dock at a settlement called Alden Reach within a day, and that I would live there until, in his words, we figure out what peace actually looks like. He said it with a small, tired laugh, as if the idea of peace was something even he found difficult to imagine after so many years of war. I studied his face as he spoke, searching for the calculation I expected to find there. Every diplomat I had ever known wore their courtesy like armor, each kind word measured for effect. I could not find that in him. It made me suspicious in a way that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with instinct. A person who does not perform kindness for advantage is either extremely dangerous, or they are exactly what they appear to be, and in my experience, danger far outnumbers sincerity. That night, alone in the small quarters given to me, I did something foolish. I searched the room for listening devices, for hidden restraints, for any sign of the cage I was certain must be disguised as comfort. I found nothing. Only a bed too soft for a warship, a single window showing stars I did not recognize, and a door that, when I tested it, opened freely from the inside. I stood in that open doorway for a long time, staring down an empty corridor that led, as far as I could tell, toward freedom I was not brave enough to take. Not because guards would stop me, there were none in sight, but because I understood, with a cold and sudden clarity that I had no idea what waited beyond that door, and for the first time since arriving, I realized that not knowing was far more frightening than any cage could ever be. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window and watched the stars shift as the ship moved, and I thought about the reports our fleet commanders had sent home before their silence. I thought about how none of them had ever described a battle. They described losing contact. They described returning home with half their crews and no memory of what had defeated them, only that something had, and that it had not felt like an enemy at all. By morning, the ship had docked, and Elias came to collect me himself rather than send an escort. I asked him, as we walked toward an exit hatch, why he had come personally rather than send a soldier. He looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize many times in the following months, a look of quiet surprise at a question that, to him, did not need asking. "You are going to be my wife," he said. It seemed rude to send someone else. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and we stepped out together into the open air of a world I had been told, by every report and every warning my people had ever given me, belonged to the most dangerous force in known space. The settlement of Alden Reach spread out before me under a pale morning sky, and it looked nothing like a garrison, nothing like the militarized worlds I had imagined humans building for themselves after a decade of war. There were no towering walls, no visible defense platforms scanning the horizon, just streets and buildings and people walking freely between them, none of them looking twice at the alien woman stepping off a warship beside their commander. I remember thinking, in that first moment, that either humanity had grown so careless in victory that they no longer feared attack, or they understood something about safety that my own people had never learned. I did not yet know which thought frightened me more. Elias led me through the streets toward a modest house near the edge of the settlement, explaining as we walked that it would be our home for now, that I could change anything about it I wished, that no one would disturb me if I preferred solitude, and that dinner was usually shared in a communal hall nearby if I ever wanted company. He spoke as though offering choices, not issuing terms, and I found myself listening for the hidden condition in every sentence and finding none. When we reached the house, he opened the door and stepped back to let me enter first. I hesitated on the threshold, waiting for some final instruction, some rule I had not yet been given. He simply waited, patient, until I understood that no instruction was coming, that the choice to enter or not was entirely my own. I stepped inside. The door did not lock behind me. There was no click of a mechanism sealing me in, no sound of guards taking their positions outside, only silence, and the soft light of a home that had been prepared, it seemed, with genuine care rather than calculated appearance. I turned to look at Elias, standing in the doorway, and I asked him the question that had been building in me since the moment I arrived. "Why are you being kind to me?" I said. "I am the price of your victory. I am supposed to be a symbol of what you took from us." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was low, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, something old and careful, that I would not understand until much later. "We did not take anything from you," he said. "We just made sure you would stop trying to take something from us." I did not understand what he meant that day. I only remember the chill that ran through me at his words, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and everything to do with the sudden, quiet certainty that I had walked into something far larger and far stranger than any war my people had ever truly understood. The door remained unlocked that night, and every night after. It would take me far longer than I expected to understand why that terrified me more than any cage ever could. Over the following days, I began to notice the smaller details of the life around me, details that did not fit the story I had been told my entire life about the enemy we had fought for over a decade. The people of Alden Reach moved through their routines with an ease that seemed almost careless to my eyes, trained as they were to read threat into every posture and every silence. Children ran through the streets without escorts. Merchants argued over prices without fear of punishment. No one lowered their voice when a person in uniform walked past, the way my own people instinctively did in the presence of authority. I asked Elias about this on our third evening together, as we sat in the quiet of the house he called ours, though I still thought of it as a place I was merely being kept. I asked him where the soldiers were, the ones who should have been watching the streets, watching me, watching for any sign of rebellion from a population that had, after all, lived through more than a decade of war. He told me that most of the fighting had never touched Alden Reach at all. That the war, from where he stood, had felt distant. Something fought at the edges of human space, rather than something that reached into their daily lives. I asked him how that was possible, how an empire could fight a war for 11 years and still let its people live so completely undisturbed by it. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something in his expression made me feel, for the first time, that perhaps I had been asking the wrong questions from the very beginning. "Maybe you should ask why the war never came here," he said quietly. Instead of asking why we are not afraid. I did not sleep well that night either. I lay awake, turning his words over in my mind, searching for the answer he clearly wanted me to find on my own, and finding only the uneasy shape of a truth I was not yet ready to face. The first week in Alden Reach taught me more about humans than 11 years of intelligence reports ever had, and none of it matched the picture my people had built of the enemy. I had grown up on stories of human aggression, human unpredictability, human willingness to strike without warning. What I found instead was a settlement that ran on routine, humor, and something I can only describe as a stubborn refusal to be afraid of small things. A woman named Nora Bennett ran the bakery 2 streets from our house, and she greeted me every morning with the same bread and the same joke about the weather, regardless of whether I understood it. A man named Peter Hale repaired machines in a workshop near the square, and he once spent an entire afternoon explaining to me, in painstaking detail, why a broken water pump mattered more to him than any battle report from the war. At first I assumed this was performance, a careful show designed to convince me that humanity was harmless. I watched for the mask to slip. It never did. Elias worked long hours, often returning home only after the sky had gone dark, and though he never spoke of the details of his duties, I began to understand that his role involved coordination between human command and what remained of the diplomatic channels with the compact. He carried the weight of it quietly, without complaint, and without the performative exhaustion I had seen so often among compact officials eager to be praised for their sacrifice. One evening, I asked him directly what his rank meant, what authority it granted him, expecting the answer to reveal some hidden hierarchy of control I had not yet uncovered. He told me, almost sheepishly, that his title translated roughly to coordinator, and that most of his work involved making sure supplies reached the right places and that people were not left waiting on decisions that could be made quickly. It sounded, to my ears, almost insultingly simple for a man who had been chosen to receive a foreign bride, meant to end a war. I began to wonder if I had been given to someone unimportant as a final insult, a quiet humiliation disguised as diplomacy. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that importance, among humans, was not measured the way it was measured among my own people. The turning point came, on the 9th day, in the square near the bakery, when I witnessed something that unraveled the last of my assumptions about how humans handled conflict. 2 men, both known to the settlement, began arguing loudly over a delivery that had arrived late and damaged. Among my people, such a dispute would have quickly escalated, each man calling on witnesses, invoking family names, threatening consequences that would ripple through generations. I had seen disagreements over far smaller matters end in exile, in duels, in decades of quiet retribution passed down like inheritance. Here, the argument grew loud, voices raised, hands gesturing sharply, and for a moment I braced myself for violence, certain that this was the mask finally slipping, the true nature of these people finally revealing itself. Instead, a third man walked over, listened for a moment, and simply said that they were both being unreasonable and should split the cost of the damaged goods between them. The 2 men grumbled, argued a little more out of pride rather than genuine anger, and then, astonishingly, shook hands and returned to their business as though nothing significant had happened at all. I stood frozen at the edge of the square, watching them part ways without a single threat exchanged, without either man's dignity requiring the other's humiliation to be restored. It should have reassured me. Instead, it frightened me in a way I did not expect. I understood, in that moment, that this ease, this casual resolution of conflict without violence or lasting resentment, was not weakness. It was confidence. These were not people who avoided conflict because they feared its consequences. They avoided prolonged conflict because they did not need it to prove anything to themselves or to each other. And a people who do not need to prove their strength through constant small violence are usually the people who have already proven it somewhere else, somewhere I could not see. That night, I asked Elias about the argument I had witnessed, expecting him to explain some special training the settlement's people received, some deliberate program of conflict management designed to keep the peace during wartime. He simply laughed, gently, and said that people argued over broken deliveries all the time, war or no war, and that it rarely meant anything more than two tired men having a bad day. I pressed further, asking him whether such disputes ever escalated, whether pride ever demanded satisfaction the way it did among my people. He grew quiet for a moment, and then told me something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said that humans had learned, a long time ago, through wars fought entirely among themselves, that pride was rarely worth what it cost to defend. He said it plainly, without drama, the way one might mention a fact about the weather, and yet something in his tone made it clear that this lesson had not been learned easily, nor cheaply. I asked him what wars he meant, expecting stories of skirmishes between settlements, or minor disputes between nations still finding their footing before uniting under one banner. He did not answer directly. He only said that it was a long story, one better told by someone who had studied it more carefully than he had, and that perhaps I would understand it better when I was ready to hear it. I did not know then how deliberately he was avoiding the subject, nor how carefully every human I met seemed to steer conversations away from the deeper history of their own past. At the time, I only felt the frustration of being kept, once again, from information I believed I deserved to have. Over the following weeks, I settled, cautiously, into a rhythm of life I had not expected to find in enemy territory. I learned the names of the people who lived near our house. I learned which foods agreed with me and which did not. I learned that Elias preferred silence in the mornings and conversation in the evenings, and that he listened far more than he spoke, a habit I found both comforting and unnerving, since I had spent my entire life among people who spoke constantly to fill silence with the appearance of control. I also began, slowly, to notice the absence of things I had expected to find. There were no monuments to victories in Alden Reach, no statues commemorating fallen enemies, no public displays celebrating dominance over the compact. When I asked about this, a woman named Ellen Marsh, who ran the settlement's small archive, told me that humans did not build many monuments to wars they were still trying to forget, and that the ones they did build were rarely about winning. I asked her what they were about, if not winning, and she looked at me for a long moment before answering that they were usually about remembering what it cost to stop. I did not understand her fully then. I only remember the strange chill that settled over me at her words, the same chill I had felt on my first night in that unlocked house, the growing sense that I was standing at the edge of a truth far larger than anything my people's intelligence reports had ever prepared me for. It was during this time that I began to notice something else, something that troubled me more with each passing day. Despite living among a settlement of humans for weeks, despite walking freely through their streets, and eating at their tables, and listening to their quiet, ordinary lives, I had not once seen anything resembling the full might of the force that had fought my people to a standstill for over a decade. I had seen no warships beyond the single transport that brought me here. I had seen no massed formations of soldiers, no displays of the weapons that had turned entire compact fleets to silence. I had seen bakers and mechanics and archivists and a quiet coordinator who preferred listening to speaking. If this settlement, and the people within it, represented the force capable of defeating my empire, then either my people had grossly overestimated humanity's strength for over a decade, or humanity had been showing us only the smallest possible fraction of what it truly was. I did not yet know which possibility frightened me more, but I knew, with growing certainty, that I would not rest until I understood the truth, and that the answer, whatever it was, would change everything I believed about the war that had shaped my entire life. The question began to consume me in a way I had not expected, growing quietly through the weeks, until it sat behind every conversation I had, every meal I shared, every quiet evening spent beside a man I was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to trust. Why had the Compact never won a single decisive battle against humanity in 11 years, despite fielding more ships, more soldiers, and more resources than this small, unremarkable settlement seemed to represent? I started asking the question directly, to anyone who would answer it. I asked Nora at the bakery, who laughed and said she had never fired a weapon in her life and would not know where to begin answering something like that. I asked Peter at the workshop, who shrugged and said the war had always felt like something happening far away, something he heard about on broadcasts rather than something he ever expected to touch his own life. I asked Ellen at the archive, who grew quiet, and told me that the full history of the war was recorded, but that most people preferred not to dwell on it, since dwelling on old fears rarely did anyone much good. Every answer I received was different, and yet every answer shared the same strange quality. None of them described the war as something total, something that had ever truly threatened to consume their lives the way it had consumed mine. My people had lost colonies. My people had lost fleets. My people had spent 11 years reorganizing our entire economy, our entire military doctrine, our entire sense of identity around the singular struggle of surviving this war. And here, in the heart of the empire we were fighting, people spoke of it the way one might speak of a distant storm that occasionally delayed a shipment of goods. I began to suspect that the settlement of Alden Reach had simply been shielded from the worst of the conflict, perhaps deliberately, perhaps as a reward for some contribution to the war effort I did not yet understand. I decided to ask Elias directly, on an evening when the house was quiet and the weight of unanswered questions had grown too heavy to carry politely any longer. I asked him plainly why Alden Reach had been spared the worst of the war, while my own people's worlds had suffered burning skies and collapsing supply lines for over a decade. He set down the cup he had been holding and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something careful, something guarded, as though he were choosing each word with the precision of a man walking across unstable ground. He told me that Alden Reach had not been spared anything. He told me that this settlement was, and had always been, simply what human life looked like, war or no war, because the war itself had never demanded the kind of sacrifice from ordinary human life that it had demanded from mine. I did not understand, and I told him so, my frustration finally breaking through the careful diplomacy I had maintained for weeks. I asked him how a war fought for 11 years, a war that had cost my people entire fleets and entire worlds, could possibly have cost humanity so little that its people continued baking bread and repairing water pumps as though nothing at all had changed. He was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard in him before, something old, something careful, something that sounded almost like grief held at a great distance. He told me that the war, from humanity's side, had never been fought as a total war, that the ships sent against the Compact represented only a small portion of what humanity could field if it ever chose to field everything at once, that the strategy from the beginning had been one of restraint, of minimal escalation, of ending conflicts quickly and quietly rather than allowing them to grow into something neither side could control. I asked him why. I asked him why an empire with the strength to end a war decisively would instead choose to drag it out for 11 years through half measures and restraint, when a full commitment of force might have ended everything in a matter of months. He looked at me then, with an expression that I can only describe as sorrow, and he said something I have never forgotten, something that changed the shape of every thought I had carried about this war since the day I first stepped off that transport ship. He said that humanity had learned, at great cost, exactly what happens when it stops holding back, and that no one who understood that lesson ever wanted to relearn it, not even against an enemy as persistent as the Compact. I pressed him further, desperate now for the details he seemed determined to withhold, but he shook his head and told me it was not his place to explain that history to me. He said that if I truly wanted to understand, I should speak with someone who had studied it more deeply, someone who could show me rather than simply tell me. He mentioned a name I had not heard before, a woman called Grace Linden, who worked at the settlement's Central Archive and had spent much of her career studying humanity's own history rather than the history of the war we were currently fighting. I did not sleep again that night. I lay awake, replaying his words, turning them over and over, searching for the shape of the truth hiding behind them. Humanity had learned what happens when it stops holding back. The sentence sat in my mind like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. The next morning, I sought out Grace Linden at the Central Archive, a quiet building near the edge of the settlement that I had walked past many times without ever entering. She was an older woman, with the kind of patient, careful manner that reminded me, oddly, of the scholars who had once taught me history in my own palace, though her subject matter, I would soon learn, was far darker than anything I had studied as a child. I explained to her what Elias had told me, and I asked her directly to explain what he had meant, what history lay behind his careful, sorrowful restraint. She studied me for a long moment before answering, as though weighing whether I was truly ready to hear what she had to say. She told me that humanity's history, long before it ever encountered the compact or any other species among the stars, was a history soaked in conflict, fought entirely among themselves. Wars between nations, wars between ideologies, wars that had, over the centuries, grown steadily larger and more terrible as human technology advanced faster than human wisdom could keep pace with it. She told me of a period in humanity's past, centuries before their first contact with any other species, when their wars had grown so total, so consuming, that entire cities had been erased in moments, entire populations displaced or lost, entire generations shaped permanently by the trauma of conflicts fought without limit or restraint. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with the same caution Elias had shown, as though even discussing this history carried a weight that required handling with great care. I asked her what had stopped those wars, what had transformed a species capable of such total conflict into the quiet, restrained people I had come to know in Alden Reach. She told me that humanity had not simply stopped fighting. They had instead built something new, something born directly out of the horror of what they had done to themselves. They had built doctrines, structures, and command systems designed specifically for one purpose: to ensure that humanity would never again stumble carelessly into total war without understanding, completely and absolutely, what such a war would cost. She explained that these systems were not designed for everyday conflicts, not for the kind of policing actions and limited engagements humanity found itself drawn into with expanding into the stars. They existed for a different purpose entirely, held in careful reserve, activated only under conditions that humanity itself had defined with painstaking precision, conditions that required an enemy to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, a genuine commitment to humanity's total destruction. I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended, whether the compact had ever come close to meeting those conditions. She looked at me with something like pity in her eyes, and told me that as far as she understood, the compact's war against humanity had never once approached that threshold, that every campaign fought against my people had been conducted using only a small fraction of what humanity could bring to bear, restrained deliberately, managed carefully, treated more as a persistent disagreement to be contained than an existential threat to be answered in full. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of her words settle over me. 11 years. 11 years of losses that had reshaped my people's entire civilization, fought against an enemy using only a fraction of its strength, holding back not out of weakness, but out of a hard-learned fear of what happens when restraint is abandoned. I asked her, finally, what would happen if the compact ever did cross that threshold, if some future campaign, in desperation or miscalculation, finally triggered the conditions she had described. She did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window of the archive, toward the quiet streets of Alden Reach beyond it, the bakery and the workshop, and the ordinary lives moving peacefully through their day, entirely unaware of the conversation taking place within these walls. She told me that she hoped, sincerely, that I would never have to find out, and that the kindest thing any diplomat could do for both our peoples was to ensure that question was never answered. I left the archive that afternoon with a weight in my chest I had not carried before, a weight built not from fear of what humanity might do, but from a dawning, uncomfortable understanding of what humanity had already survived and what it had built from that survival. I thought of the unlocked door in our house, the casual ease of the settlement streets, the quiet confidence of people who had no need to prove their strength through small acts of dominance. I understood, finally, that this confidence was not the confidence of a people who had never known total war. It was the confidence of a people who had known it completely, and had built an entire civilization dedicated to never allowing it to happen again, except as an absolute, final answer to an absolute, final threat. I returned home that evening to find Elias waiting for me, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me he already suspected what I had learned. I did not need to explain. He simply asked, gently, if I understood now why the war had been fought the way it had, why restraint had governed every decision humanity made against my people, even in the face of 11 years of ongoing conflict. I told him that I understood the shape of it, but not the whole of it. I told him that I needed to see, not merely be told, what humanity had built from that history, if such a thing could even be shown to someone from outside their own kind. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not quite read, before finally nodding, slowly, as though coming to a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. He told me there was a place, not far from the settlement, that might help me understand more completely than words ever could. He told me it was not a place humans visited lightly, nor one they often chose to show to outsiders, but he also told me that if peace between our peoples was ever going to hold, if the marriage that had brought me here was ever going to mean something beyond a formality signed in desperation, then perhaps it was time I saw it for myself. I agreed, though something in his tone told me that whatever waited for me there would change me in ways I could not yet imagine, and that once I saw it, there would be no returning to the woman who had stepped off that transport ship weeks earlier, still believing she understood the shape of the war that had defined her entire life. Elias took me the following morning to a place outside the settlement, a quiet stretch of land reached by a short transport ride through fields I had not known existed beyond the edges of Alden Reach. The building that waited for us there was low and plain, built from simple gray stone, with none of the grandeur I had come to expect from places of historical importance among my own people. There were no towering statues, no carved reliefs celebrating triumph, no banners announcing the glory of a nation. Only a quiet entrance, and beyond it, a long hall lit by soft, even light. Grace Linden met us there, having arrived ahead of us, and she walked beside me through the entrance with the careful, measured pace of someone leading a visitor through a place that demanded respect rather than mere attention. Elias walked on my other side, silent, his expression distant in a way I had not seen from him before, as though this place carried memories even for a man who had not personally lived through the history it commemorated. The hall opened into a wide chamber, and it was there that I first saw what remained of a weapon humanity had built and chosen never to use again, except as a warning kept carefully in reserve. It did not look like the weapons of my people's imagination, the towering engines of destruction our own military doctrine celebrated in propaganda designed to frighten enemies and reassure citizens alike. It sat quietly on a raised platform, dark and unassuming, more like a monument to restraint than a monument to power. Grace explained that it represented only one small piece of a much larger system, a system built not for conquest, but for a single, terrible purpose, to answer any threat capable of triggering humanity's absolute survival response, with a response equally absolute. She told me that this particular weapon had been decommissioned generations ago, replaced by systems far more advanced, but preserved exactly as it stood, unchanged, as a reminder to every generation of humans who walked through this hall of exactly what their ancestors had once been capable of building, and exactly what circumstances had once made building it necessary. I asked her what those circumstances had been, and she led me further into the hall, toward a section lined with quiet, simple plaques, each one bearing names I did not recognize, dates that meant little to me, and brief descriptions written with a restraint that somehow conveyed more weight than elaborate language ever could. She told me of the final human war fought entirely among themselves, a conflict that had grown, through miscalculation and pride and the slow accumulation of grievances no one had been willing to resolve peacefully, into something that had threatened to consume the entire species. She told me of cities lost, of populations displaced across generations, of an entire civilization brought to the edge of an ending it had built with its own hands. She told me that it was only in the final, desperate moments of that conflict, when total destruction seemed not merely possible but inevitable, that humanity had finally, collectively, chosen restraint over annihilation, not because they lacked the power to destroy each other completely, but because enough of them, at the last possible moment, understood what that destruction would truly cost. I asked her how humanity had ensured such a conflict would never happen again, and she gestured toward the quiet hall around us, toward the weapon resting on its platform, toward the careful, deliberate architecture of restraint I had witnessed throughout Alden Reach since the day I arrived. She told me that humanity had built systems, doctrines, and traditions specifically designed to prevent any future conflict from reaching that threshold again, except under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Circumstances defined with painstaking care by generations of survivors determined never to let their descendants stumble into the same catastrophe unprepared. She told me that this was why humanity's approach to every conflict since then, including the war against my own people, had been governed by such careful restraint. Not because humanity lacked the strength to fight harder, but because every human alive carried, in some quiet corner of their upbringing, the understanding of what happens when restraint disappears entirely, and no one wished to be the generation that forgot that lesson. I stood in that hall for a long time, silent, absorbing the weight of what she had shown me. I thought of the 11 years of war my people had fought against humanity, the fleets lost, the colonies silenced, the desperate marriage arranged to end a conflict my own council believed we were losing through sheer exhaustion. I understood now, with a clarity that left me almost unable to speak, that we had never been fighting the true strength of humanity at all. We had been fighting the smallest, most careful fraction of it, held back deliberately by a species terrified, in the most reasonable and hard-earned way possible, of its own capacity for total destruction. I asked Grace, my voice quieter than I intended, what would have happened if the compact had somehow triggered the conditions she described, if some desperate campaign, in its final throes, had convinced humanity that total destruction was genuinely and unavoidably intended against them. She did not answer with words at first. She simply looked toward the dark, quiet weapon resting on its platform and let the silence of the hall answer for her. Elias finally spoke, his voice low, breaking the silence that had settled over us. He told me that the systems built after that final human war were designed never to activate lightly, never to respond to ordinary conflict, ordinary aggression, or even ordinary losses. They existed only to answer a genuine, unmistakable intention toward annihilation, verified through careful, deliberate processes designed specifically to prevent any accidental or premature escalation. He told me that in 11 years of war against the Compact, those conditions had never once been met, not because the Compact lacked ambition, but because every Compact campaign, however costly, had ultimately remained a conflict over territory, over pride, over the slow accumulation of grievances neither side had been willing to resolve through diplomacy. It had never once become a war aimed at humanity's total erasure, and so the deepest, most terrible answer humanity possessed had never once been called upon. I asked him, almost afraid of the answer, what would have happened if it had? He looked at me then with an expression that held no anger, no threat, only a quiet, heavy sorrow that told me more than any answer could have. He said simply that he hoped I understood now why every empire that had ever fought humanity through history, whether human empires fighting each other in ages past, or now the empires of other species reaching across the stars, eventually learned the same lesson, usually far too late to matter. He said that humanity did not fight to win, not in the way my own people understood victory. Humanity fought to end conflicts as quickly and as carefully as possible, holding back everything it could, because every human alive still carried, somewhere within their history and their upbringing, the memory of what happens when that restraint finally breaks. I left that quiet hall with Elias and Grace that afternoon, carrying a weight I had not expected to bear when I first agreed to see this place. I understood now why Alden Reach had never felt like a settlement shaped by war. I understood why its people moved through their days with such quiet confidence, untouched by fear of small disputes or minor threats. I understood, finally, why humanity's approach to an 11-year war had felt, from the very beginning, less like a fight for survival and more like a careful, patient effort to contain a conflict before it could ever grow into something neither side would survive. I understood, too, with a clarity that frightened me more than anything else I had learned since arriving, that my own people's council, in their desperation to end a war they believed they were losing, had come far closer to that terrible threshold than any of them likely realized. Every escalation, every desperate campaign, every increasingly reckless attempt to break humanity's resolve through overwhelming force had been, without any of us understanding it, a slow and dangerous approach toward a line that, once crossed, offered no possibility of return. I knew then, walking back toward the transport that would carry us home to Alden Reach, that I carried a responsibility far greater than any I had imagined when I first left my own people's palace weeks earlier, believing myself merely a bride offered up to end a war through arrangement and formality. I understood now that I might be the only person from my own empire who truly grasped how close we had come, and how carefully that final line needed to remain uncrossed if my people were ever going to survive what remained of this conflict. I requested passage back to compact space within the week, and Elias arranged it without question, though I could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what I intended to do, and exactly how difficult it would be to make my own people listen. He did not try to stop me, nor did he insist on accompanying me as an official representative of humanity. He simply told me, before I boarded the transport, that he trusted me to say what needed to be said, and that he would be waiting in Alden Reach for whatever answer the council chose to give. The journey back felt longer than it had felt arriving, though the distance had not changed. I spent much of it composing and recomposing the words I would use before the council, searching for a way to explain what I had learned, without sounding as though I had simply been charmed or manipulated by careful human hospitality. I knew how such a report would be received by a council desperate to believe that humanity's restraint was weakness rather than warning. I knew I would need more than words to convince them, and I carried with me, carefully prepared, records and testimonies that Grace Linden herself had helped me assemble, evidence of a history my own people had never had access to before. The council chamber looked exactly as I remembered it, tall and ornate, filled with the same officials who had sent me away weeks earlier as a formal price for peace, expecting nothing more from me than a symbolic function fulfilled quietly and without complication. I stood before them now as someone entirely changed, though I doubted any of them could see it in my face. I told them everything. I told them of the unlocked doors and the quiet settlement of Alden Reach, of bakers and mechanics living lives entirely undisturbed by a war that had reshaped every aspect of our own civilization. I told them of the quiet hall outside the settlement, of the decommissioned weapon resting on its platform, of the careful, deliberate restraint humanity had built into every level of its response to conflict, born from a history of total war fought entirely among themselves, a war so catastrophic it had nearly ended their species before they even reached the stars. I told them, most importantly, that the war we had fought for 11 years had never once been fought with humanity's true strength, that every campaign, every loss, every silence following a failed offensive had been the result of a fraction of what humanity could bring to bear, held back deliberately, managed carefully, treated as a conflict to be contained rather than an existential threat to be answered in full. The chamber fell silent after I finished speaking, a silence heavier than any I had experienced, even in the quiet hall Grace had shown me. Some of the council members exchanged glances of disbelief, clearly unwilling to accept that an empire we had fought to a standstill for over a decade had never truly engaged us with anything close to its full capability. Others, I noticed, grew pale, their expressions shifting from disbelief towards something closer to dawning horror, as they began to understand exactly how close our own increasingly desperate campaigns might have come to crossing a threshold none of us had known existed. An elder counselor, one of the few among them who had always argued for caution even when the rest of the council pushed for further escalation, finally broke the silence to ask me the question I had been dreading since I first understood the truth myself. She asked me what would happen if we continued the war, if some future campaign, in its desperation, finally convinced humanity that total destruction was the compact's genuine intention. I told her the truth, as plainly and carefully as Elias and Grace had told it to me. I told her that none of us would survive to regret the miscalculation, that humanity's restraint was not a limitation on their strength, but a choice, hard-earned through their own history, and that choices, unlike limitations, could always be revisited if the conditions demanding them were finally met. The debate that followed lasted through much of that day and into the next, arguments rising and falling across the chamber as decades of pride and fear and old grievances collided with the new, uncomfortable truth I had brought before them. Some argued that I had been deceived, manipulated by careful human hospitality into believing a story designed to weaken our resolve. Others argued that my account matched too closely with patterns we had already observed throughout the war, patterns of restraint and minimal escalation that had never made sense under our previous assumptions about human strategy. In the end, it was not my testimony alone that swayed the council, but the quiet, careful presentation of evidence Grace had helped me prepare, records of humanity's own ancient history, testimonies recorded generations ago and preserved exactly for moments like this one, moments when some future conflict threatened to repeat mistakes long past. Faced with evidence they could not easily dismiss, and faced with the terrifying possibility that continued escalation might finally trigger a response none of us could survive, the Council voted, narrowly but decisively, to honor the peace treaty in full, and to withdraw entirely from any further military engagement with human space. I returned to Alden Reach not as a hostage fulfilling a diplomatic formality, but as someone who had, in some small way, helped ensure that both our peoples would continue to exist beyond the shadow of a war that had nearly cost us everything without any of us fully understanding the stakes. Elias met me at the transport dock himself, just as he had on the day I first arrived, though his expression now carried none of the careful, guarded distance I remembered from that first meeting. He simply asked me how it had gone, and I told him, honestly, that I did not know if the peace would hold forever, but that for now, it would hold long enough to matter. In the months that followed, I settled more fully into the life I had once believed was merely a temporary arrangement, a formality to be endured until circumstances allowed me to return home. I came to know Alden Reach not as enemy territory, but as a place shaped by hard-earned wisdom, its quiet streets and unlocked doors no longer signs of carelessness, but signs of a confidence built from having already survived the worst conflict imaginable, and having chosen, deliberately and permanently, never to repeat it without absolute necessity. I came to know Elias not as a captor assigned to receive a hostage, but as a man shaped by the same careful restraint I had witnessed throughout his people, someone who listened more than he spoke, because he understood, perhaps more deeply than most, exactly how much weight words could carry when they came from someone capable of ending a conflict entirely. I think often of that first night aboard the human transport, of the unlocked door I stood before, too afraid to step through it, certain that whatever waited beyond it would be more dangerous than any cage. I understand now that I was not wrong to feel that fear, though I misunderstood its source entirely. It was never danger waiting beyond that door. It was understanding, and understanding, I have since learned, can be far more frightening than danger ever could, because it demands that you rebuild everything you once believed about the world, piece by careful piece, until nothing remains of the assumptions you carried in with you. My people still speak of the war in careful, measured terms, still uncertain how to reconcile 11 years of loss and struggle with the knowledge that we had never truly faced humanity's full strength at all. Some among the council remain resentful, believing that humanity's restraint was itself a kind of insult, a suggestion that we were never worth fighting seriously in the first place. I have come to believe something different, something that took me far longer to understand than it should have. Humanity's restraint was never an insult. It was a mercy, offered not because we deserved it, but because humanity itself had learned, at a cost none of us could fully imagine, exactly what the alternative would mean, and had chosen, generation after generation, never to offer that alternative lightly. I think this is why no empire that has ever truly studied humanity's history dares to push them toward that final, terrible threshold. Not because humanity announces its strength through conquest or display, the way empires like my own once measured power through monuments and displays of dominance. Humanity's strength lives quietly, held in careful reserve, visible only in the restraint they choose to exercise every single day they do not use it. I married a human to end a war I believed we were losing through simple exhaustion. What I learned instead was that we had never been fighting a war at all, not in the way we understood the word. We had been testing the patience of a species that had already fought and nearly lost the only war that ever truly mattered to them, and had built an entire civilization dedicated to ensuring they would never have to fight it again, except as the final, absolute answer to a threat that left them no other choice. I do not know what the future holds for the peace between our two peoples. I know only that I now stand beside a man who never once needed to threaten me to earn my respect, in a settlement that never once needed walls to keep its peace, among a people who understood, long before my own empire ever encountered them among the stars, that the truest measure of strength is not how readily it is used, but how carefully it is held back, year after year, generation after generation, until the only ones who ever discover its full weight are the ones who were foolish enough to force its hand. I hope, for the sake of everyone I have ever loved, that we never become that foolish again.